After studying this module, you shall be able to define what is sensation and perception with its importance in cognitive psychology. We will also explain about the perceptual processes of perception, identify determinants of perception and different perceptual sets. We will begin this section by first understanding what is sensation and perception. The perceptual processes allow us to experience the world around us. Both sensation and perception work in understanding and interpreting the stimuli around us. For example, you have been asked to look around where you are sitting right now and notice the objects you see. Maybe you will notice the windows, trees, people around you, wherever you are placed currently. What you have done is just perceive the patterns, objects, things, people and even events around you. All these things help make the conscious experience and allow us to interact with the people and object around us. Therefore, perception is the process by which the sensory input or information is organized and interpreted into a meaningful experience. Further, this module will help us in understanding different approaches towards understanding what perception is and what are the different depths involved in perception. Now, let us focus on what is sensation and perception. Our world is active with all sorts of stimuli, which include all the objects and events that might surround us. Sensation and perception are the processes that help us to become aware of and recognize those various stimuli. It is with the help of sensation and perception we are able to perceive an object by paying attention towards it. It may seem strange to think about it this way, but in reality we don't experience these stimuli directly. Rather, our senses allow us to get information from our environment and then take that information and form a perception of the world. Accordingly, this helps us in understanding what sensation is. Sensation is basically a process of receiving and transforming the stimulus energies into neural energy. Physical energy such as light, sound and even heat is detected by specialized receptor cells in the sense organs. These receptor organs would be your eyes, ears, skin, nose and tongue. When the receptor cells basically register a stimulus, the energy is converted into an action potential that relays information about the stimulus through the nervous system of the brain. When it finally reaches the brain, the information travels to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex. The brain gives meaning to sensation through perception. From here, the role of perception starts taking place. Perception is basically the process of receiving the sensory input and further interpreting it into meaningful world around us, and involves both the recognition of environmental stimuli and actions in response to these stimuli. With the help of these perceptual processes, we gain information about the properties and elements of the environment around us, and which holds importance also. Perception not only creates our experience of the world around us, it also basically allows us to act within our environment. Perception with the help of sense organs, which we have mentioned earlier also, was skin, touch, eyes, nose, enable us to basically receive and process all the information on the state of and alterations basically in the environment. For example, a set of senses were basically involved in the ability to detect changes in body positions and in movements. It also involves the cognitive processes which were there or which are necessary for further processing of information, such as recognizing the face of the friend or detecting a familiar scent. So all these things, for that we basically involve our cognitive processes. According to Allen and Jones, perception consists of basically 3 components. Now let's try and focus on these 3 components. First, the perceiver. Perceiver is a person who becomes aware about something in the environment and further comes to a final understanding. There are 3 factors that can influence his or her perceptions. These 3 contents or factors would be experience, motivational state, and finally an emotional state. Second is the target. This is the person who is being perceived or judged. Ambiguity or lack of information about a target leads to a greater need for interpretations and additions. And the third factor out here is the situation. Situation also greatly influence perceptions because different situations may call for additional information about the target. When a perceiver focuses on something, he or she may start giving meaning to the events around them for detailed understanding. Now let's understand what are perceptual processes. Goldstein in 2002 have given a model of perceptual process which helps in basically understanding of the sequence of steps that begins with the environment and leads to our perception and an action also in response to the situation or a stimulus. This process is basically a continual process, but when we perceive something, we do not tend to pay greater deal of time thinking about the actual process at that very given moment. So this process is also being shown in a diagram which will basically explain about the continual perceptual process, where perception is basically through recognition, action, your environmental stimulus which is there, your attendant stimulus which you are focusing on, your stimulus or the receptors are also there, your transduction is coming into account, your processing is there, which further leads to perception, and the knowledge also from processing also leads to your perception. In order to understand how the perception process works, let's start by breaking down each one of them into steps. Step 1, environment stimuli are all those things in our environment that has the potential to be perceived. It includes anything that can be touched, seen, smelled or heard, and even those objects in the environment that can be changed with position to our body. We can explain this with an example. You have gone for jogging in the park. What all you see there are your environmental stimuli. The people you notice talking to each other, children playing, cars passing by, and even tree branches swinging by breeze, all these serve as the starting point of a perceptual process. Step 2 is the attendant stimulus. Attendant stimulus is the specific object in the environment on which our attention is focused on. The attendant stimulus can be any familiar stimuli, and in some cases we are likely to pay attention to stimuli that have some degree of novelty. We can also explain this with an example, that for example for stimuli that are familiar would be face of a known person in a crowd, and novelty would be the pantless man standing near the bus stop. From a previous example referred in the first step, what might be the attendant stimuli there? During your morning jog, if you notice birds chirping on the trees, the birds represents your attendant stimuli. Therefore, the bird becomes the center stage on which you are focusing your attention, and all other things are left aside. Step 3 would be stimulus on the receptors, is which when you pay attention to a particular object, by directly looking at it, an image of that object is formed on the receptors of the retina of your eye. For example, while jogging, your attendant stimulus was bird, as your focus of attention was on it. Now this image of the bird is formed on the retina. How this image is formed on the retina. The first part of this process involves the light actually passing through the cornea and pupil onto your lens. The role of the cornea is to basically help focus the light as it enters the eye, and the iris of the eye controls the size of the pupils in order to determine how much light to let in. The cornea and lens acts together in this project an inverted image of the retina. The image which is formed on the retina is still not perceived because the image on the retina is basically upside down from the actual image which you are looking at in the environment. This visual information which is there will be changed even more drastically in the next step on this process. The step 4 out here is the transaction process, in which the image on the retina is then transformed into electrical signals. This further basically allows the visual messages to be transmitted to the brain that can be interpreted. Therefore, we can say that it is a process of basically transformation of one form of energy into another. For example, when a button is pressed on the bank teller machine, the PSY produced, basically the pressure which is produced by the finger is transduced to your electrical energy. So how you are able to interpret the image on the retina? The answer is that the rods and cones basically contain molecules called retinal, which is responsible for reducing the light or reducing the light into visual signals that are basically then transmitted via your nerve impulses. Let's understand the step 5, which is basically the processing. It is the next step of perceptual process, where electrical signals are basically undergo neural processings. So the path which is followed by a particular signal basically depends on what form of signal it is. Through the series of interconnected neurons located throughout the body, electrical signals are basically transmitted from the receptor cells to the brain. In our previous example, the image of birds chirping was basically on the trees was basically received as the light on the retina, which is then transduced into an electrical signal and then processed through the neurons that are located in your visual networks. These electrical signals basically generate new signals also in the cells of the nervous system called the neurons. This process is basically referred as the neural processing. Now let's understand what is step 6. Step 6, which is the perception, is the next step of perceptual processing. Perceive the stimulus object in the environment. It is at this point that we become consciously aware of the stimuli or the stimulus. Thus, it is the conscious sensory experience. When the electrical signals produced by the neurons are somehow processed by the brain and transformed to the experience of seeing the bird, the stimulus is said to be perceived. Hence, we are aware of the stimuli from our environment and also in fact become fully consciously aware of what we have perceived. The next stage or the next step is your recognition. Recognition is basically the ability to interpret and give meaning to the object. Our brain plays an important role in categorizing and interpreting what all it is being seen. Thus, recognition is our ability to basically place an object into category. Continuing with an example, it is in the recognition stage of the perceptual process that we become conscious that there is a bird on the tree, and the recognition stage is an important part of perception since it allows us to give meaningful interpretations of the world around us. By placing objects in the meaningful category, it enables us to understand and to react to the world around us. Now, the step 8, which is your action. It is the final step of perceptual process. Perception involves some sort of action in response to environmental stimuli. Action could involve a variety of motor activities such as turning your head away to look at something else. This action phase of perceptual development involves some type of motor actions that takes place in response to the perceived and recognized stimulus. This might involve a major action similar to running towards a person in distress, or something as subtle as blinking your eyes in response to a puff of dust blowing through the air. Till now, we have discussed and understood the steps which are involved in perceptual process. But one aspect which basically plays a very important role in this continual process is basically the knowledge. It seems to have an important impact on two stages, which are your processing and your perception. Now let's understand what the knowledge content plays an important role and how it plays it. Knowledge has an important part or role to play in the ability of an individual to basically recognize different objects, events or situations. For example, using previously acquired and stored knowledge of different animals, the man was able to recognize and identify the bird sitting on the branch of a tree. Thus, knowledge is involved while perception basically triggers your recognition. The inclusion of knowledge of information in this cycle makes it possible for us to distinguish between two types of perceptual processing. When the process starts from the stimulus on receptors and further basically travels towards the perception, it is called the bottom up processing. The process that starts with the knowledge that a person gathers from the environment is a top down processing. Now let's understand what are the different determinants of perception. How do we explain that individuals might look at the same object or thing yet perceive them to be differently? A number of factors basically operate to shape and sometimes distort your perceptions. These factors can reside within the perceiver from the object or target being perceived, or in the content of the situation in which the perception is made. Different factors basically influence in the perception of objects around us or in the world. To understand, two views exist. One that focuses on the external factors involved in the perception of objects, and another is the constructivist perspective, which are your internal factors. Before explaining on these two views, it becomes necessary for us to understand what do we mean by perceptual set. Perceptual set theory stresses the idea of perception as an active process involving basically selection, inferences and interpretations. Perceptual set refers as a bias of readiness of the perceiver of the available sensory data and to ignore others. Thus, perceiving and recognizing of the objects depends not only on objective qualities, features of the object, but also on the conditions the organism is in, called perceptual set. Therefore, perceptual set is the easiness with which a particular category is used for perceiving a particular material. It depends on two groups or the factors which are there. First is the external factor and second is the internal factor. External factors are basically responsible for learning the probability of occurrence of certain objects in a given category. If one expects that a given object might occur, he or she will recognize it more easily. A typical example of the influence of external factors is the phenomenon of priming. If man has been previously or consciously informed about the kind of stimuli to be exposed, their recognition will be easier. Internal factors are basically associated with the internal organizations of categories one uses when perceiving. External factors affecting perceptual set includes basically first is the frequency. It refers to how often objects of a given category occurred in the past. This will help us in focusing our attention to that specific object which had occurred number of times. Repeated external stimulus gathers more frequency, or repeated stimulus gathers more attention than a single one, therefore stating the frequency principle. Repetition is one of the most regularly used technique in advertising and is the most common way of attracting people's attention. Frequency results in making people aware of the stimulus. Now the stimulus intensity. If other stimulus is comparable, more intense stimulus attracts more attention than a subtle one. We can take an example: a loud siren gets more attention than a faint one. Thus, sound plays a very important role in perception of an object. Third is the stimulus magnitude. Stimulus magnitude also plays an important role in attracting our attention. For example, a large advertising board attracts more attention than a smaller one. Therefore, the size of the object affects our perception. Social consequences. Category commonly used by others seems more ready. Example is in ambiguous situations, this can be confirmed by such social phenomena as stereotyping, conformity, or diffusion of responsibility. Next would be the context. Berner in 1951 illustrated how context of alphabets and numbers plays a very important role in your perception. By showing the participants an ambiguous figure of 13 in the context of letters of numbers, the physical stimulus 13 is same in each case, but it is perceived in different way because of influence of the context in which it appears, which you can also see in the figure. Next is your motivation, which are your basically these are categorized into your internal factors which affects your perceiver while perceiving the categories, and the first one is the motivation. It has been viewed that motivation will affect the speed and the way in which we perceive the world. Alport in 1955 has distinguished 6 types of motivational influences on perception, which are your bodily needs, your reward and punishment, your emotional connotations, your individual values, your personality, the value of object. We can also say that Goldman had aimed to explain how motivation may influence your perception. They had asked both poor and rich children to estimate the sizes of coins. It was observed that poor children overestimated the size of every coin more than the rich children. Sandford in 1936 basically deprived participants for food with varying lengths of time up to 4 hours and then showed them confusing pictures. Participants were more likely to interpret those pictures to be related with food as they had been deprived of food for a longer period of time. Next is your emotions. Many researchers have suggested that our emotional state will be affected the way that we perceive the events. For example, there is a term called perceptual defense that refers to the effects of emotions on perception. Number of findings from different experiments show that when we perceive words which might evoke unpleasant emotions take longer time to be perceived at a conscious level than the neutral words. It is almost as if our perceptual system is defending or stopping us from being upset or offended, and it does not allow us to perceive something as quickly as it should. The next internal factor out here is your expectations. Expectations basically refers to the idea that we perceive to some extent, which are basically influenced by our own expectations. Expectations is useful as it allows the perceiver to focus their attention on particular aspects of incoming sensory information and allowing them to know how to deal with the selected data, how to classify, understand it, and even name it. Expectations basically affects other aspects of perceptions also. For example, we might fail to notice printing errors or writing errors because we are expecting to see words or letters. The next internal factor would be your culture. The cross-cultural studies seems to indicate that history and culture basically plays an important element in how we perceive our environment. Perceptual set is concerned with the dynamic nature of perceptual processes, and clearly there may be a difference cross-culturally in the kinds of factors that basically affects our perceptual set and the nature to its effect. Derigotsky in 1972 investigated on the fact that whether pictures are seen and understood in the same way by different cultures. His findings have even suggested that perceiving perspectives in drawings is in fact refers to as specific cultural skill, which are basically learned rather than automatic. He found people from several cultures to prefer drawings which don't show perspective but instead are split as to show both sides of an object at the same time. Till now, what we have studied in this module, let us have a summary of that. Let's recap what we have studied in this module till now. Sensation, the process of receiving stimulus, energies from the external environment and then transforming these energies into neural energy. Perception is basically the process of organizing and interpreting all the sensory information from our environment, and we further give meaning to it. It also involves the cognitive processes required to process the information. There were three components of perception, and we have also identified the role of perceiver, the target and the situation out here. We have also studied the perceptual model as explained by Goldstein, which helps in understanding the sequence of steps involved in perception. It is a continual process where each step has its own importance, from environmental stimulus, attendant stimulus, stimulus on the receptors, transduction, processing, perception, recognition and even action. Different views had existed to explain the factors involved in perception of objects. The two views that plays an important role are your external and internal factors. External factors basically affects your perceptual set, are your frequency, context, intensity, magnitude and social consequences. Internal factors, which were the relevance are the study to determine perceptions are the role of motivation, expectations, emotions and the cultural context.